When forecasting the amount of wind shear we should expect this hurricane season, one of the big things we need to take a look at is the Enzo outlook over the next several months. And as you can see, as we approach a hurricane season months, the most likely scenario is that we will be in an El Nino phase, which will play a major role in terms of the amount of wind shear we should see in the Atlantic this hurricane season. Because typically during an Enzo El Nino pattern, we see stronger than usual wind shear because there's a stronger upper level westerly flow that's gonna definitely disrupt tropical cyclone development because the surface winds are moving from the east rather than the west in the upper levels, and that creates a strong amount of wind shear. So that's definitely gonna play a role in terms of the amount of tropical cyclones that will develop. Here's a better look at what typically happens during an Enzo El Nino pattern. So since the equatorial Pacific is experiencing sea surf temperatures are much warmer than average, we see a lot more convergence occur right around the equatorial Pacific, and as a result more convection in this area. And since there's so much lift in this area where the sea surf temperatures are much warmer than average, all that air that's in the upper levels of the atmosphere has to sink somewhere, and typically that air would want to sink in the Atlantic where there's a lot less instability, there's a lot less lift, and as a result a lot of the air that's in the upper levels right around the equatorial Pacific would want to move towards the Atlantic, and as it does so, that creates a stronger westerly flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere, which definitely inhibits tropical cyclone development because the westerly winds are going the completely opposite direction as surface level winds, which are moving from the east. So that creates a stronger amount of wind shear when we see a change in wind direction with height, which is the reason why that typically during an Enzo El Nino pattern, there's a lot, the wind shear is a lot stronger and we see less tropical cyclones than average. So this is a good indicator that this year that we're more likely to experience stronger than usual wind shear. But we need to look at other factors and other data points before we can really jump to that conclusion that we're going to experience more wind shear than average in the Atlantic, because it's not just the Enzo pattern where we need to take a look at when determining the amount of wind shear that will exist in the Atlantic this hurricane season. We need to take a look at several different data points. Another thing that could determine the amount of wind shear we will experience in the Atlantic this hurricane season is the amount of precipitation over not only the main developed region but the Saharan desert region as well, because there's been a recent study that suggests that when there's more precipitation than average along the West African coast, that typically means that there's less wind shear than average, as we see a lot more lift, and as a result of the higher amount of precipitation over the west coast of Africa, there's typically a stronger upper level easterly flow that would push a lot of the moisture towards the West African coast. So typically when we see precipitation a lot higher than average, that typically means that there's less wind shear than average all throughout the main development region. So that's only another thing we're going to need to take a look at to really determine the amount of wind shear we should expect this hurricane season. And we see it with this diagram right here. In a year where there's less precipitation than average along the West African coast, we typically see a stronger westerly flow in the upper levels, which definitely inhibits tropical cyclone development and increases wind shear because it's going against the surface level easterly winds. But if we were to move into this other diagram where where there's a little bit more precipitation than average right up along the West African coast, we see that the upper level winds are stronger from towards the east, which creates less wind shear and more favorable conditions for tropical cyclone development. Now, this study isn't necessarily 100%. This study may not be 100% representative of how the wind shear will turn out, because there still could be errors with this study. It isn't 100% accurate, but this could be a good indication of the amount of wind shear we could see in the main developed region if there's a little bit more precipitation than average. But again, take this study with a grain of salt because it hasn't been researched thoroughly just yet. But there are indications that point towards more precipitation along the western African coast will lead to less wind shear. Taking a look at the precipitation anomaly over the West African coast, we do see that the CFS model is forecasting that between the most active months of the hurricane season, which includes August, September, and October, we're more likely to experience more precipitation than average all throughout the southern Saharan desert area, as well as West African coast, as well as portions of the main development region, which could suggest that there could maybe be less wind shear than average along the right up along the main development region, despite the fact that we are in an El Nino phase. But again, take this with a grain of salt because this might not always necessarily be the case, but I'll lean towards a wind shear being a little bit lighter than you'd expect for an El Nino pattern, based on the fact that we're more likely to experience more precipitation than average in a lot of these areas, which does indicate that we're going to see less wind shear overall. Now, taking a look at the wind shear anomaly forecast from the same computer model, the CFS model, we do see that for the most part, the CFS model is expecting mainly around an average amount of wind shear for most of the Atlantic, at least where tropical cyclone development would be imminent during the hurricane season. We have the CFS model is expecting stronger than usual wind shear around the Southern Caribbean, but the Southern Caribbean doesn't necessarily experience a lot of tropical cyclones anyway, so it might not necessarily make a huge impact when it comes to the amount of tropical cyclones that will develop this hurricane season. We do see a little bit more wind shear than average right up along the East Coast, but again, not a ton of tropical cyclones develop that far up north, so it might not really matter that much in the grand scheme of things when it comes to the amount of storms that will develop. However, it could be definitely good to point out that if there's stronger than usual wind shear right up along the northeast, that might not necessarily prevent the amount of storms that will develop, but that will certainly help prevent storms from coming any closer along the coast of the United States, since the westerly winds would likely be stronger in an event where the wind shear would be stronger than average. So that certainly could mean that the East Coast will experience less storms, at least less storms that will come close to the coast thanks to stronger than usual wind shear. But for the most part, we do see that in the main development region, in the Gulf of Mexico and a large portion of the Caribbean, the CFS model is expecting mainly an average amount of wind shear. And by the way, this includes the main hurricane season months as well, such as August, September, and October, and even moving into the other months, it doesn't really change that much either. Maybe in the early part of the hurricane season, we do see a little bit more wind shear right around the main development region, but again, we very rarely see tropical cyclones form that early in the hurricane season, at least in the main development region. So again, it might not necessarily mean much when it comes to the amount of storms that will develop. So overall, the CFS model is expecting mainly an average amount of wind shear, despite the fact that there's an El Nino, and if we're going to see more precipitation than average along the West African coast, that could mean that maybe the main development region will experience less wind shear than average, but I'm leaning more towards average because I do expect the El Nino conditions to sort of balance it out and bring a little bit more wind shear to the Atlantic than you'd expect. Another thing that I believe is good to take a look at when it comes to determining the amount of wind shear you should expect this Atlantic hurricane season is the North Atlantic oscillation, where typically during a negative North Atlantic oscillation, there's far more jet stream dips, and that leads to a stronger amount of wind shear, of course, because we're more likely to see the strong westerly winds move southward and go against the surface level winds, which creates a stronger amount of wind shear, and jet stream dips, and are more likely to deter storms away from the coast, which would certainly be the best case scenario in a lot of cases. And taking a look at the North Atlantic oscillation forecast over the next several months, we do see that for the most part, the forecast is that we're mainly going to stay in the negative North Atlantic oscillation phase for the foreseeable future up until June and July. So we're going to need to wait and see if this continues for the rest of the hurricane season into August and September, when the most storms will develop. That would certainly be better news, because we'd see more jet stream dips, which would deter storms from the coast and also prevent new storms from developing thanks to stronger than usual wind shear. So we're definitely going to need to keep an eye on North Atlantic oscillation forecast over the next several months to really determine how much wind shear will be located in the Atlantic. But for the early hurricane season months, the current index is showing that we're more likely going to be in a slight negative phase, so that likely will lean towards a little bit more wind shear than average existing, at least during the early part of the Atlantic hurricane season. But we're going to need to wait and see if that continues into August and September, and it's a little bit too early to determine that. But typically a trend I noticed with the North Atlantic oscillation is that it typically wants to stay in a certain phase for around 1 to 3 months. So if it were to stay in a negative North Atlantic oscillation phase for this long, my fear is that the oscillation index will change into a positive phase once the hurricane season months are the most active, which would limit the amount of wind shear. But we're just going to need to wait and see at this point. So here's my wind shear outlook for this hurricane season. So for the main development region as well as much of the western Atlantic, I'm expecting mainly moderate wind shear, around an average amount of wind shear, because while the CFS model is forecasting that most of this area will experience around an average amount of wind shear, not necessarily above average wind shear or below average wind shear, as well as the fact that that we're going to see more precipitation than average along the West African coast, which promotes less wind shear than average. I do believe that an El Nino will balance the conditions out to the point where we're more likely going to experience mainly average wind shear this hurricane season for the Atlantic, which would mean that our hurricane season total is more likely to land right around average when it comes to the amount of storms and hurricanes that will develop. And then I'm expecting stronger wind shear right up along the western Gulf of Mexico, as well as the southwestern portion of the Caribbean. And the reason why is because this area is going to be very close to the equatorial Pacific, so it's definitely going to feel the effects and the stronger wind shear that's associated with the divergence in the upper levels over the equatorial Pacific, where we're going to see a stronger, the westerly winds in the upper levels are strongest in this area closest to the equatorial Pacific. So I do expect the wind shear to be stronger than usual in this area as a result. So I expect more of the storms to develop a little bit more eastward than you'd expect this hurricane season. But overall, I'm expecting a mainly average year when it comes to the amount of wind shear. But yeah, guys, I thank you guys for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more hurricane season videos like this. I plan to do more updates regarding the hurricane season and taking a look at different factors that could play a role in the amount of storms you will experience. But yeah, guys, I thank you guys for watching.